My name is Kimberly Cloutier Green, and I have the honor of being the 9th Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we're gathered here today to speak with the 4 extraordinary women who were there at the very beginning of the creation of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program. In fact, they were the ones who made it all happen. And we're going to today try to draw out the story of those origins, and maybe also to take a look at where we are now and where we might imagine we're going out ahead. And but first, what I'd like to do is introduce each of these lovely women. And with us we have Marin Tirabassi, who is a clergywoman and writer of both prose and poetry. She served in the initial planning phases of for the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program and served on the first incarnation of the board, but you're a member of the board now as well, all these years later, and you are the 3rd Portsmouth Poet Laureate. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mimi White is a poet and the 5th Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, a founding member of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program, and I love this detail. You also worked with Nancy Moore Hill as an artist in residence in several Portsmouth schools while Nancy was with us, and we're going to be talking about Nancy Moore Hill during our time together today. Paula Race, welcome. You are the Vice President of Development and Community Engagement at the Children's Museum of New Hampshire. And you are also a founder of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program and served as co-chair with Nancy Moore Hill for its first 15 years.
Or so.
Or so.
I lost track
or
of
so.
the exact number.
Mary Laughlin, you are a retired Portsmouth high school educator, is that correct? Or many
K through 12.
K through 12. Mm-hmm. Lovely. Portsmouth schools educator, and I love this piece about you, that Nancy Moore Hill invited you to participate in the Lullabies and Reveilles Neighborhoods Project in 1999, and subsequently asked you to join the board, the Portsmouth Poet Laureate Board, and you served through 8 Poets Laureate.
I did.
You stepped down just as I came on, so I missed you, and I'm sorry about that. I think you also served as the treasurer for many of those years, didn't you?
Yeah. All of them, maybe? Yeah.
Yes.
Invaluable.
Yes, yes.
There was one job Nancy was never interested in doing. So.
No.
Okay. Well, then it was very important for you to be on the board. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to begin with a conversation about what was going on in the city of Portsmouth in the 90s that was so yeasty, so fertile, that it might give rise to something like the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program. When I first became Poet Laureate 2 years ago in April, I was very conscious of stepping into a program that had integrity and longevity, a history that I had the honor to sort of join. That there had been 8 Poets Laureate before me and wonderful projects. And so I'd like to go back to the beginning and ask what was happening in the art scene in Portsmouth, and what relationships, what opportunities were presenting themselves that led to the creation of the PPLP, and we'll be calling it the PPLP from here on out because it's so much easier. It's otherwise a mouthful. And Paula, I'd like to start with you. If you wouldn't mind giving us a sense of what was going on in Portsmouth.
Portsmouth in the 90s. A lot of downtown live art scenes. There was more live music happening. There was a very collaborative spirit in the air. A young Chamber of Commerce director who was open to a lot of new ideas. Not that today's is not, but it just seems a simpler time to, let's try something. The music hall was new and very vibrant and bringing in a lot of different arts presenting arts of all different styles, and it was very exciting. And the schools were also presenting a lot of artists in residence. Performance and participatory arts experiences were very much a part of the school year in all of the areas. It was supported by the State Arts Council very heavily. At the time, it was called Greater Piscataqua Community Foundation, was very supportive. There were more support financially for arts experiences. It was a little easier to get funding for those kinds of things. And the mid-90s was when the Shipyard Project happened at the Music Hall, which was a huge catalyst and really the seed of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program and many, many other events and arts organizations that are still going today.
Could we just dig down a little bit into the Shipyard Project, and maybe you could say a little bit about what relationships were formed there, or some initial collaborations that maybe would help us understand the kinds of collaboration that followed from that.
Sure. The Shipyard Project was really the idea of the then board chair, Chris Dwyer, which was a brilliant idea, and it was about bringing new audience to the music hall who was not attending and trying to figure out why. And the idea of working with a military installation and the very large workforce there and trying to connect them with the music hall in a way that meant something to them was the way it started. And it was also a time when the shipyard was going through a base realignment and closure, which is known as BRAC, which was a very serious threat to closing the base. And this project, in some way, I think, helped keep the shipyard open, and that music hall staff testified at a BRAC hearing, and it was a big deal. It was a big way of showing how important the base was to the community, and not just to the production of nuclear subs. And so the third piece of that, so the shipyard, the music hall, and the community here, but also the artistic force behind that was the Liz Lerman Dance Exchange, which is a very multi-generational, diverse modern dance company in Washington, D.C., who had been to the music hall in 1992. So we had some relationship with them. And we got a 2-year, I was co-director of this project, we got a 2-year grant from the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Foundation for an Arts Partners community arts grant, which allowed us to go into the community and tap into many, many different constituents that would have some connection with the shipyard. And so we met with current employees, former employees, military, members of family members who had worked at the shipyard, people who were against military installations, musicians, dancers, anyone we could think of who might be interested. And because of the way Dance Exchange worked, they wanted to meet with the community and find out their stories and what their connection was and how they felt about it. And they just navigated through all of these stories, these personal stories, looked for the greater themes, and then used those themes to shape a 10-day performance all over the city after that. And so from that experience of having non-identified artists, people who had never maybe danced before, on a stage with professional dancers, and all walks of life, people formed connections and relationships with one another that they wouldn't have ordinarily, and that experience changed everyone who was involved. So that when it ended in 1996, Portsmouth was recognized for having done this wonderful thing that was really nationally recognized. And Nancy Moore-Hill and John Wheeler, who was a shipyard employee, received a grant from the New England Foundation for the Arts called the Building Community Through Culture grant. And they were just charged to do something with that in their community. And Nancy wanted to do something with poetry. And we didn't know what that would look like, but the working group, which we were part of, began meeting around that issue, that charge of do something in the community that has to do with poetry. It could be a one-time event, it could be a publication, it could be anything. And that was Nancy's idea, which was her right as the fellow. It could have been about anything. And
Thank you.
so that experience of working in community and listening to the community and using the arts as a way to build community came from the shipyard. And then the ripple effects go from there.
Thank you so much. So let's stay there with this working group that began to imagine the next step. And I'd like to turn to you, Maren. You participated in the shipyard project. Is that right?
No.
No, you did not. But you were part of this working group.
I was part of the working group.
Okay, tell me how you became involved in the working group, and what did you see happening there, and what was, happening there that especially drew you, and how did you help move the group forward?
Besides eating a great many pretzels
Yes,
in
lots
the middle
of pretzels.
schools, yes, that was Nancy's snack of choice. I think because I had done a number of artists in residence in Don Darrow School in the middle school was how Nancy came to know me and be involved in sort of poetry scene. So she invited me to be a part of the working group as well as Mimi to have poets on the group,
Right.
so that rather than just community organizers to say, well, as a poet, how would this feel to you? So it's a lot of bouncing back. Oh, this, this sounds good and this doesn't, and that was a piece of a lot of initial meetings that were a lot of bouncing a lot of ideas around. She was a remarkable personality for hearing everyone's voices and then fusing them together. So she had this sort of tenacious focus on using this money and getting this project done, but it didn't bother her at all to listen at a meeting where you would never think you could coordinate all the different ideas that people had brought in, and yet at the end of it, she could sort of, in 2 minutes, say, so we've heard tonight, blah, 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 and it actually sounded like what we'd said made sense. So a piece of that. So I got to do an awful lot of responding, and then she did all the work in between the meetings. Well, she didn't do all of it. I'm pretty sure that actually Paula did a lot of it. But she was like, I'll do that. Oh, I'll do that. And I go, great.
Yeah, that's true.
I think what we're going to do is maybe take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because I'd like to talk a little bit about the Artists in Residence program a little bit, because that feels like an important part of the history here. Mimi, would you maybe just step in at this time to sort of speak about what that was and how you participated in that work?
And then I want to talk about Nancy in
Sure.
connection with that.
Sure.
Because I think I started in the Artists in Residence program in 1980.
Yeah.
And there was federal money that came down through the National Endowment for the Arts. New Hampshire didn't match very well, but the money was coming. And so it funded programs for artists all around the state to be in schools, but also in nursing homes, in prisons, in residences for elderly, for students. And I had the fortune of working in that program for several years, and I worked with Nancy. Nancy and I actually met each other before that when I was a parent coordinator for Title I. And Nancy came and took my job when I left.
Oh.
And I left to be an artist in residence.
I never
And then,
knew that.
so Nancy did that. Nancy also owned an island, and I owned an island. So we sort of hit it off right away. And when she got into the schools, I started working pretty much with Nancy, many places. I think the fermentation of arts in Portsmouth was partly because there was this large public policy that arts mattered.
Yeah.
And Portsmouth was a community that took that, that embraced that. Also, I think in the 80s and into the early 90s, and others could help me with this, artists could still afford to live in Portsmouth. So not only
Yeah.
did you have working artists, but you had artists making art and living in this town. When real estate really became unaffordable, many of them exited, and I think that when they lived here, that actually helped. And part of that was the artists in the school. So Nancy and I had a long relationship. Nancy called me when she learned about this money, and she said, "Meet me." So she and I went to the Old Valley Steakhouse on Route 1 bypass. It was still in operation. And we sat there, and she said, "What could we do with poetry to create community?" And so I said, "Well, we have a national poet laureate. We have a state poet laureate. Why don't we have a Portsmouth poet laureate?" I said, "But this one's going to get funded."
Yeah.
I said, "The state poet laureate doesn't get any money. They work for 5 years." So Nancy and I sort of bantered that idea around. And so from that conversation at Valleys, that idea was one of the ideas. I don't know if we had other ideas, but that was sort of at the very beginning. And I don't know that we had a working committee. I think then,
Well, that was earlier
that
then.
was, yeah.
That was pre.
That was pre a committee. You know, it was just like, what can we do? And since we'd worked together a lot, I just thought, I think we need to have our own poet laureate. And so I think we then ran with that, and we had a very flamboyant and wonderful poet laureate in the wings with Esther, you know, sort of waiting.
I
Not
have
that
a
she
question
knew,
about
not
Esther.
that she knew anything about
Yeah.
what was happening, but so it just kind of grew out of conversations. And then Nancy pulled together a great group of people who had different skills, you know, from being able to count money, which is really important, to people who could create poems, to people who could create community. And she was a genius at that. But I think you're right, the fermentation was here. Artists were here.
And can I just add something?
Absolutely.
An interesting thing, when my husband Donald came here to be the director of the music hall, that he had not seen in other communities, was that there was a working group of leadership in all the arts organizations that met together regularly to support one another. And he had only been in towns where the different arts organizations were at each other's throats for the grant, for the this, for so there was not a level where organizations cooperated. And here there was not that, well, if you get this, then I won't feeling. It was, how can I help you with your project? And I think that undergirded, in addition to the artists, to have actually the management kind of people think that it was important to work together. I think that was a piece of the scene as well.
So we're coming out of the shipyard project, and Nancy has been given this money, and conversations have begun, and some initial sort of visioning is going on. There's a working group that's formed. I'd like to move now to the development of the board, and I'd like to do this, ask you, Paula, to speak briefly about how the working group evolved into the board, or how the board took shape. You know, what were the beginnings of that? And then I'd like to move to you, Mary, and have you speak a little bit about the finances of this project as you have both managed and understood them. So Paula, how did the board first come to be?
The board grew out of the working group. And the working group, I'd say the core was is here with a couple of people who aren't here. Camille
Who's
Weedy.
missing?
Camille
Camille.
Weedy
Yeah.
was there from the beginning. Ellie Sanderson was there fairly early on for a brief amount of time. Mark Miller, who was the editor of a magazine called Portfolio at the
Yeah.
time, was there from the beginning. And we added people just to grow a little bit, and we needed expertise, and we knew of others who were interested in this kind of work. So the board really grew out of the working group. It became, we just got a different name. We weren't a 501c3 at the time, but we did become that, and so New Hampshire Theatre Project was our original fiscal agent, and we had the board, the working group of the Poet Laureate program is charged with bringing to fruition the Poet Laureate's idea of what they wanted to do during their reign. And Esther Buffalo, our first Poet Laureate, wanted to make a CD of poets who had been nominated, and they each got to invite a friend. So there were 20 poets reading on the CD, and a flute ensemble from the middle school who played the interlude music, and we recorded at Fish Tracks, which was a recording studio at the time, right downtown Portsmouth. And the recording sessions were hilarious and wonderful. And one thing I know Mary will talk about finances, but one thing we learned right off the bat is don't do a project that you don't have funding for first, because we just did it. And we had a little bit of money, but it didn't cover the expenses because we had beautiful inserts and beautiful photography, and it was all very important. And so it took us a while to pay that off. We had an anonymous donor, and to cover the expenses, that we did pay it off. But we learned that very first year that we have to get the funding first, and then do the project. So that was a really good lesson.
Do you still have a box of CDs in your car?
I do. I have a box of CDs. But it was a great project, and we had a great release party. And then the board grew from, because each Poet Laureate is selected by a selection committee, and so sometimes people moved on and off of the selection committee onto the board, or might have become a Poet Laureate from being on the selection committee at one time. So there was a great group of people that, we always wanted a city councilor, and Mike Huxtable from the library was involved and was on the board for many years. So we wanted to have as rounded of a group in the city as possible. So we were hoping for educators and poets and other artists and city councilors or librarian and people from the library. So that's how the board grew.
Thank
And then
you.
of course you know two friends and they know two friends, and you get involved in one project and then you stay, and it's one of those great amoebas that just keeps growing.
Thank you. Mary, I wonder if you could speak about your relationship with Nancy Moorhill, and just remember her. I would love to hear your remembrances of Nancy, and in that context, speak about how you were drawn in to the board and how you understood the work of the board in the very first years.
Okay. It's interesting just sitting here listening to what people are saying, because you mentioned your meeting and she said, meet me. If I took out my notes from years gone by, there were many meet me's.
Yes, yes.
Not necessarily for like, but for one thing or another. Nancy would have an idea and she'd say, what do you think of this? And just go with it. I guess looking at the total picture, well, Nancy's life in general, she was totally committed to anything she did, for herself as well as for everyone else. And she never asked more than she was doing. You know, if you did one job, she did 5. Like you just mentioned something about, she'd say, oh, Marion said, I'll do it. And it didn't matter whether it was, you taking a hammer and nail and putting up one of Robert's pieces.
And she'd write it in pencil.
Exactly. She did always write in pencil and sign
I'll
everything.
bring the cookies.
Signed everything best in. And over the years, that was that was the way she did everything, as I say, with the, from Esther's project to the postcards, to whatever it was. She would just take every little piece, and it was, she never, the rest of us would say, I do the money, but it was never that with Nancy. She did every single piece. She did the, the design and the knocking on doors to see where she could hang where we could hang the things from John's project. It just went on and on. And she did everything with such enthusiasm. The money piece was always, in her mind. I think you mentioned something, another thing I was going to say about Nancy, integrity and something, I forget the other word you used. But again, that was Nancy. But back to the money, I think that first year that project happened, there wasn't enough money. And after that, Nancy was always concerned that first of all, she wrote many grants over her years. I have no idea how many grants Nancy wrote, but she was always, and she'd always go, I'll take care of that. And those of us who have written grants, it's not an easy job to do, but Nancy always did it. And then after that, as years went on, with the money, I can remember sitting at board meetings and someone would say, why don't we do such and such, or why don't we give everybody such and such amount of money? And Nancy she'd always pull back on the reins and say, no, we need to have the endowment and we need to make these programs self-sufficient. And that was an important piece. And I think that's why we're in the position we are today, because lots of different ideas that would be floating out there that seemed like great ideas, but not on the practical side. And so it could pull us back to make sure we were doing.
Thank you, Mary.
An important piece about the money early on was Michael Simchick, who is at 100 Market Street building. And Nancy and I had gone to visit him to ask for a donation towards the endowment and talked about the Poet Laureate program a little bit. And Michael sat there, and he asked us some questions no one else had asked about, our general expenses and how much does it cost to run the program for a year, and what are our goals. And we thought, oh, he's just not interested, and he's just going to send us on his way. And he offered to, what if I pay the expenses for the program so that you can concentrate on building the endowment, and that way you'll get there faster instead of little bits and pieces, which was a huge, generous offer. And he made a commitment for a certain number of years, and I think he tripled that, and said, you're doing more, your expenses are probably higher, so I'm going to give you this. And it was just the most generous, clever, forward-thinking thing to do. It enabled us to reach our goal of eventually, which is double what we originally thought, more than double what we thought we would need to cover the projects that we do. But without Michael, it wouldn't have been possible, and he was very low-key about it. We did nominate him for a Business Committee in the Arts Award early on, which he did receive, which was great. And he's really the one who had the initial idea for the poetry hoop. There was a coffee shop in his building called Just Brew It.
Yep.
And he spoke with Robert Dunn, who was the Poet Laureate at the time, and said, I want to bring people to the coffee shop. Would you read some poetry or do something? And they hatched the idea of a hoot. And it's, from the very beginning, was packed with people, packed with people. And we held it there for a couple of years, and then it changed hands, and we were just too crowded. And there isn't a coffee shop there anymore, but the Hoot's been going ever since.
Right.
And it was Michael's idea to, and he, has an art gallery there, so he's very much a patron of the arts. Although he'll say he doesn't know anything about the arts, he understands the value of it, and he's sort of the godfather of the Poet Laureate program. Really.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I actually wanted to stop here for a moment and hear your reflections on the Hoot. I remember it way back then, and how full and exciting, and things when they first begin have this tremendous energy. It still does have tremendous energy. And I wonder if we could just reflect for a moment on what makes the Hoot run. You know, what from the beginning and maybe its middle life, well, up to now, what is the energy there? What's happening in the community that the Hoot is such a vital part of the arts world and of poetry in the community? And what has it given rise to? I'm wondering, would you, for instance, say that Jazzmouth grew out of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program or the Hoot? Has Beat Night at the Press Room, does it have connections with the Hoot?
I actually read in some of our old minutes. I'm going to get the date. In December of 1999, Larry Simons called Nancy and wanted to know if we could call poets, we could get some poets for his words and music night at the Crazy Cat Lounge.
Yes.
Does anybody remember the Crazy Cat Lounge?
Yeah.
Not there anymore, but
Yeah.
I'm guessing that Beat Night and Jazzmouth grew out of that. But
Yes.
you know, there was this, you know, the Poet Laureate program was pretty new at the time. It was only a year or so old. So I think we helped a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, at least he knew where to call to, so we could put that word out.
There's a
And-
locus for
Right.
poetry now.
And
Yeah.
you know, again, we just kind of, everybody helped where they could, and it was a collaboration. It was the tide rises, all boats rise with the tide.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I think
Right.
Nancy had an instinct about poetry. You know, she said she never wrote one, but there was that
We know
wonderful
she did.
poem, that
Yeah.
wonderful
Yeah.
poem that Luke read. And I think she knew that if we had an organization and then a venue, the power of poetry would make itself known and others would come. Like, if you build it, they will come. And that was really true for the Hoot. Everybody could read. We brought in well-known poets or poets who had some track record, just sort of set the tone. But anybody and everybody could come. And I think we all have favorite moments in Hoots, but I think one of my favorites was someone who read their poem from the bathroom. Because they were so nervous.
Yeah.
They didn't want anybody to see them. And so they were mic'd up and we could hear their poem. And I don't even remember if it was a student, a young person, or an older person, but clearly there was a space for everybody. If you wanted to read a poem, and it could be someone else's poem, we wanted to have you come. And somehow Nancy knew that that was going to happen. You know, maybe she hadn't envisioned every piece of it, but she understood that poetry mattered in many, many lives, and that there would be listeners as well as readers.
Right.
Because there were a number of poetry readings at that point. I mean, there was a lot of that, but that balance between having the invited poets, the more skilled or the more practiced poets, not necessarily big name, but you know, the more doing a longer piece and then having that whole sense of a variety of people reading was, I think, the real gift of that mirrored that initial discussion about having a poet laureate that would be chosen on gifts of poetry and gifts of community engagement, rather than, there are certainly states in the United States that have poets laureate based on the quality of their poetry and the ability to, say, write a poem when a new sewage system comes out and, you know, please write a poem for this event, or, you know, I mean, but it's about their skill. And then there are other places where it's all about engaging people, but holding those to intention, which the Hoot did and which then the call for the Poet Laureate did in parallel, I think was a piece of that genius.
Yes. Yes, let's stop there and probe this, the history of the Poets Laureate in Portsmouth. Maybe what we could do here is talk about how this process of nominating and installing a Poet Laureate works. So what are the sort of, what's the system, what's the process of that? But then what I'd like to do is hear about projects that have happened in the city. And I think out of that conversation is going to come more of how the Poet Laureate program works. So maybe it would be helpful, Paula, if you would just describe how the selection process came to be and how it works.
So we decided that the selection committee would be as diverse as we could make it, and an odd number. And
this, excuse me, but the selection committee operates independently
the
of
selection
the board.
committee is not the
Nobody
board.
on the board,
Nobody
yeah.
on the board is on the selection committee.
Right.
And of course, nobody nominated is on the selection committee. And as I said, we tried to get a mix of people who are very familiar and know about poetry and writing, but also members of the community and educators and
Yeah.
city councilors, and that so that it's a 360 view as much as we can manage in a small group. The selection committee is asked to meet only twice. They meet once, and they get everyone's material, and they decide how they want to make their judgment. We decided that we would leave that up to each selection committee. So we did not dictate as a board what to look for or how to score people or how they would vote. We wanted them to come up with their own system and their own consensus, whatever that is. And that has worked.
Yes.
And then in the week between their meetings, they read everything and they come back with their choices and their reasons why, and they, you know, this white smoke comes out of the chimney and they decide by the end of the night who the poet laureate is.
So, tell them what the materials are.
The materials are 10 poems. You probably know better than I do, Maren. It's a certain number of poems.
Well, it started at 5 and became 7 and then it became 10.
Okay.
I think.
So, yeah, a number of poems. And then answers to certain questions about why they want to be a poet laureate and what they would do.
I know what those questions are.
Yeah, please say them.
What is the role of poetry in your life? What is your connection and vision for Portsmouth? And how will you engage people who have met poetry before and have not met poetry before in
your project.
In the project,
Whatever it might
yeah.
be.
Yeah.
So it was very important to hear about their what they cared about as far as the community, that we didn't just want someone to come in and publish their own book.
Right.
Or give a big reading. We really needed that engagement piece. So that's a very important part of the process. And then they're just their own resume, what they've done. So, and that's how it's been running since the very beginning.
And from the very beginning, there's always been that question of, which you framed out well, are they a really fine poet? Will they be a spokesperson for poetry? Where do you come down on that? And I've sat on enough selection committees to know that that is an important,
That's issue.
almost the question. And some of us side, I always side on the side of the poetry, you know, and other people have different ideas, which is why you want a broad range.
Right.
The selection committee is different for every poet laureate. Some people serve on committees, you know, on the
couple of
committee
times.
other times,
Yeah.
but it's not a given. It gets disbanded after that selection. What I love is that some of the participants in the Poet Laureate program have then sat on the committee. Someone who was in my project, a visual artist, sat on a committee, and that was wonderful to see those who had participated be an active voice in deciding who the next Poet Laureate might be based on their experience and what it meant for them. So I think the selection committee has worked very, very well. We didn't have one, I believe, for Esther. I believe we chose Esther. Was there?
No, there was a
No,
selection
there was a
committee.
selection
Absolutely.
committee.
Yep.
Yeah.
How could she not be selected?
No, there
Yeah,
was a
because that was the basis for the
Yeah,
CD.
there definitely was, and I could get you the list because I
Okay.
have all the files now. There
Yeah.
was a selection committee, and we commissioned Peter Hapney, a local blacksmith, to create a, you know, like a statue.
quill.
It's a quill pen.
It's in my attic right now.
Right, you know. And it always happens.
That's why it's in my attic.
Right. One of the city council meetings that happen in April, which is Poetry Month, is we get on the docket, we get on the agenda, and the new poet laureate is announced at that meeting, and the quill is presented to them from the outgoing poet laureate, and there's a little bit said about them, and then they read a poem, usually to the city council, and it's a really wonderful ceremony. And then we adjourn to conference room A and have some snacks and mingle with each other. And then the outgoing poet laureate, I don't know if this still happens, has
Get
gotten a medallion.
The Kit
From
Cornell.
Kit Cornell. She makes a
So
medallion.
That's lovely.
You will
So
get a
that's
lovely.
small
I
medallion.
remember when
was gonna
Esther was
say, that's-
recognized.
That's
Can
since
you tell
my
us-
time.
Mary, could you tell us about that? Could you
I just
tell
remember
us
the
that?
night at the City Hall when Esther was recognized. She
say,
was all
stick
dolled
that
up as as only Esther could, and she was totally surprised. You know, she wasn't really, but I could just remember she was so dramatic, and everyone said, "Oh, this
She
wonderful."
was an actress.
Oh, she was an
a
actress, and it
theater.
was very clear that night.
Yeah.
But it was very exciting.
Mary, as I see it, the board is very much involved with the poet laureate in both developing the project and sustaining the work of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program. Would you see this as how do you see the relationship between the board and the poet laureate? Would you describe it as a partnership or something else?
I think it's a partnership, but also a supporting role.
Okay.
I think that, you know, the poet laureate, well, as you did, I'm sure it presents your program. And then everyone kind of pitches in. How are we going to help this? How will this work? Where will we get the funds? You know, what kind of programs do you want to present? And some people have presented several programs. Other people have, you know, a focus on, you know, a big focus on one issue. But I think it's very much a partnership. Would be the poet's laureate would know better, but that's my
That's how you
opinion.
understood it from the point of view of the board.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, I've got you on the hook. I want to just ask you too. When you look back over your long tenure on the board, what challenges do you feel the Portsmouth Poet Laureate Board struggled with perennially, perhaps, and what breakthroughs would you like to sort of identify in terms of the history of the board?
I don't know about struggles. It's always, I guess, that constant keeping up, making certain that that the person who was selected was in fact reaching out to the community. I think that was always an issue, and I'm not certain. Struggle-wise, really.
Okay.
I think that it just Nancy was great for keeping people on task. That was probably the biggest issue. They could tend to, you know, roam off in different ways, and Nancy was always very good at pulling back and focusing on the community involvement, that whole piece, and in making each program a broad program so that it reached everyone. I think that was pretty much where I
Were
would
there
go.
big moments of breakthrough, or where you know how in any organization there are periods of time where things feel like you're sort of coasting for a while, and then boom, something happens and something breaks open, new energy, and
Yeah, I don't know. I personally felt that each time that there was a new poet laureate, they would come and present their program, and you think, how is that going to work? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, it would just all come in. And each one was just equally
You're right.
fabulous.
Yeah.
And that would be, and I don't know if I was the only one that felt that way, but you just think, I don't get it, you know, and then all of a sudden.
How is that going to happen?
Yeah.
How are we going to pay for it?
Really?
Yeah, that was a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How
how
are
we
we
gonna
going to
pay
pay
for it?
for
But
it with the dwindling
It
funds?
did happen.
Right.
And it's the idea of having a vision. I mean, the poet laureate has a vision. And
Yeah.
that you want them to have a vision. And then the working group looks at themselves, or ourselves. I was on, sat on
Right.
both sides.
Yes.
I had a vision once, and the board helped me make that happen. I remember Nancy saying, "Okay, enough." Okay, we can't do
Stop creating.
everything under
Right.
the sun.
Right.
And I'm like, why not?
Right.
I think one of the areas to address that one
Yes,
question about
yes,
struggles was,
yeah.
remember at the beginning we defined where the poet laureate could come from.
Oh, that's, yeah,
We had
that's
a
true.
geographic boundary. God forbid we should go across the river. You know, you'd think the wars had broken out, that we
Right.
were still angry at Kittery and Portsmouth wasn't ever going to include them.
Right.
But in fact, we had to reach out. We have a great, you know, community of artists, and we have a really rich writing community. But we still want the poet laureate to have some true capability. And I was always fearful that pool would shrink.
Part of that happened because it's called the Portsmouth Poet Laureate Program. So we felt we had to somehow
Have a connection.
be legitimate to what the connection was. So it was if you lived and worked in Portsmouth or a town contiguous.
Lived or worked.
Right.
Lived or worked
Worked, that
or
was
were
a piece, yeah.
contiguous in a contiguous town. And then, as Mimi said, we realized we did have to branch out a little bit for many reasons, but we were struggling with what the justification was. Why go to Kittery and not Elliott? You know, do we look at the Greater Piscataqua,
Yeah.
you know, map, or you know, what was it? Do we not go into someone else's territory if they also have a poet laureate?
Yeah, that was
so it was
an
a
issue.
It was an issue. It was a struggle to find justification for having it be what it ended up being, so that it was true to the program and also true to the the community that we were
Yeah.
trying to serve, recognizing that Portsmouth is kind of a hub, and that's the name of the program.
Of the
So-
program, and there were concerns about, it's not competitive with the New Hampshire Poet Laureate. I mean, because it's very strong. There are other, certainly
Yeah.
Rochester. I mean, there are other places,
Yeah.
but the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program is very strong, and people would say, well, can't take up too much of New Hampshire because then that really fights with that whole piece, and which is a little silly.
Right, but
But-
we came up with a good solution.
Yeah,
Yes.
but
Right.
and kept massaging the solution. I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's an interesting. Some organizations freeze at the point at which they're developed, and I think one of the health of this is, oh, this is a problem. Oh, let's be more flexible about our borders. Oh, so therefore we can fix the next problem that comes up. So there's a confidence that if we've solved some problems, that we don't have to close our doors
Right.
because something else will come up and will be an issue.
It also sounds like one of the ways we might explain the good health of the organization is that there is this every 2 years reinvigoration of a new poet laureate coming in with a new project, the initial reaction to which might be, oh no, this is too much, or it's going to cost too much, but everybody gets on board, and the next thing we know, we have a wonderful citywide project that engages hopefully every time new and more people.
Yes.
And I think we've had several projects that have, and this has a kind of taproot in the Shipyard project, several projects that have involved not only poets but other artists as well. All of the projects are available on the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program website, and you can read about the projects there. So I don't want to talk so much about the projects per se, but we have 2 Poets Laureate here, and I would love to hear from the 2 of you about, just briefly, what were you thinking of as you came on as a new Poet Laureate, in particular in relationship to the board and how you were going to be working with the board? We do just have 10 minutes, and I have a few more questions I'd like to squeeze in. So if you would just share what it was you were thinking about in your new role as a Poet Laureate in relationship to your work with the board, and how you understood that relationship, and what we should maybe hold going forward.
I started with a personal question: what is home? Because I've never felt at home in New Hampshire for several reasons, mostly political. And I realized that was a big question, and I wanted to know what others thought of it, and I wanted to think as big as I could. So I thought the best way to run a program would be to tap into existing organizations like Pontine and Voices and artists, and so we had many people, and we had writing groups, but here and actually in Stockholm. But the integral question was, what is home? And that resonated on many levels of people. people. And through bringing in other groups that already existed, we made a project that was diverse and never quite answered the question, which I think is
Which
really
is good.
Good.
Which is good.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you understand your relationship with the board?
I was very close with Nancy and very close with Paula, and I knew that they would allow that vision and help make that vision happen. But I knew it was a partnership, as you said, you know, and that the board would say to me, I could see that on their faces, how can you do that? You know, or they said, I don't think that piece will work, and I'd say that piece will work. So it was a give and take, but it was always with knowing that everybody was on the same page, because everybody wanted the project to succeed.
Right.
Everybody wanted as many people as possible to be part of a program that had integrity and that was going to address something that mattered. And I think that was the key for me. This mattered. All the programs that I've seen, and they've all done this, what you've asked has mattered in people's lives,
Yeah.
and therefore I think it continues to grow.
Thank you,
It's
Mimi.
not decoration.
And thank you for what is home. Maren, how did you experience becoming Poet Laureate and your relationship with the board getting started, and just a little bit about your project?
2 projects. Robert and I, it was a project a year at the beginning for the Poets
good.
Laureate. So,
Okay.
and you were supposed to have one that was kind of a lot of work and one that was easy.
Okay.
So my easy one was a humor festival.
Oh, right.
Had 3
that was
different,
fun.
one with teens, one that was a workshop around how to write humorous poetry, and one that was an open mic with particularly humorous poets. So it was a fairly easy, and the board loved to do that, and made litter box cake for a funny treat. It was odd, and it was the anniversary year of Ogden Nash. So,
Oh, okay.
bingo.
Very fun.
The second one that I had was an anthology, which was my gift. That's what I do, is write a lot of anthologies. And part of it was that we were out of money, and we wanted actually a project that would make money, which it actually, a book can make money.
Yeah.
So I had 100 people from 9 years of age to 100 who wrote poems. They came from anywhere, but they wrote poems about Portsmouth and environs. And the board helped me find people and helped me support people. And my premise in doing any book is nobody who submits is rejected. So it's not a competition, but they all have to be involved in an editing prospect. So board people actually helped me working with people who were not very gifted but wanted to be in this book, helped me just sitting down. So those board members, particularly the ones that were poets, really helped.
So you were really collaborating with the board.
Yes, absolutely. Felt that the board was just there every minute, I mean, I signed the contracts, I did a lot of that stuff, but so yeah, I just felt but I had been on several years before, so I mean, I knew some of the same people.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and I would like to ask you to do maybe 2 things as we close. Each of you, please speak to this. Maybe there's something that hasn't been touched on that feels important to the history of the program, the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program, and to the way that it kind of evolved. Maybe we haven't touched on it and it feels important to bring it in. And secondly, what do you think will be very important going forward for the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program? How will it continue to thrive? What are some of the challenges or hopes, perhaps, that you have, new directions the Portsmouth Poet Laureate might take? It's 2015. We're approaching, I think, the 20th year, right, of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program. We're coming on that up to that anniversary. And I would like it at that moment to be thinking about what more could we be doing, where could we go, what can happen here that we haven't yet addressed. So, what have we left out, and where are we going? So, Mary, I'd like to start with you.
What have we left out? Well, I think one thing is the scope of people that have been involved. I just recall one piece, Elizabeth Kinesis, is that her?
Yes.
Right. And going with Nancy again to the nursing home, and the excitement for those people at the nursing home. Some of them, brought poems that were their favorite poems, or somebody wrote a poem, and like you were saying, that they were certainly all different levels of excellence, but it was so moving.
Yeah.
So I think that the whole program in general has reached people that not just that project, but every project in one way or another that perhaps no one had even thought of, and just made that person's life. I felt that particular day that it was so exciting.
Thank
So
you.
that's
And anything you think we could maybe be forgetting that feels important to?
I don't really think of anything. I think that each program has been so unique that it just keeps going because everyone has such a new and different idea.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for being here today.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm so grateful. Paula.
There are so many wonderful projects and events. There are a couple of things that the Poet Laureate program was very much a part of, but wasn't necessarily a Poet Laureate's project that stick out for me. One is the Choral Jubilee in the year 2000, which was a very rich year in the arts in this town. And the Choral Jubilee was a call for poetry that the Poet Laureate program really administrated for poems to be part of an original piece of work that was supposed to be very small and grew into this major major piece. And it was commissioned to be written by Russ Grazier, who hadn't even moved back to this area, but now runs the Portsmouth Arts and Community Music and Arts Center, which was his glimmer of a hope back then. So that's pretty exciting.
Yes.
And involved several living poets who submitted their work, and then Celia Thaxter and some other poets who are dead, and 10 community choruses and musicians, and it was held at Portsmouth High School.
Fantastic.
Gym. And then Mayor Eileen Foley and myself did some, narration. It was just a tremendous project. And the World Poetry Forum, which was also an amazing international poets that we talked about translation, and that was fantastic. Where the Poet Laureate program could go, I'm just thrilled that it's still going, because I think everyone was nervous when Nancy did step down, what would happen, because she was such a force, but it's in terrific shape and moving forward and fantastic. One of the original ideas was, once the endowment came, we would turn it over to the city to run as a city council committee, and I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen, and I hope it doesn't happen.
Thank you for that vote. Thank you so much, Paula. We have just 2 minutes. I'm so sorry. Maren, have you left anything out, and where would you like to see us go?
The variety of Poets Laureate, I mean, just the personality varieties and the kinds of poetry they wrote, I think is a very interesting thing. And the Poet Laureate program engagement with Marie Harris's project, which brought all the Poets Laureate from all the states here, and the Portsmouth Poet Laureate Project was an incredible host for a lot of that as being. And one of the ideas that came from the initial working group was having, sometime in the future, a one-year Poet Laureate that would be a young Poet Laureate, and that there would be a look for a high school student or an early college age person. That was part of those, and never got developed, and I don't know if it could. It would be hard to make that one work, but how that could be, I think might be something that could happen.
I've talked to
'Cause we're
friends
solid now.
about the possibility of a hoot too, too, or TOO, that's all for young people, rather than to try to do this blending, which may or may not be a good idea. Mimi, what have we forgotten?
I would stick to the mission of creating community through poetry. I think it's absolutely brilliant, and so few words to say what a program is. So I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, but stick to that idea. And I'd like to just mention Esther Buffler and Robert Dunn, who are no longer with us, and who created wonderful projects in very different ways. And the last thing is friendship. I've seen friendships grow out of this project with people who have participated. One woman telling me, I lived here 17 years and I never had a close friend till now. And the people are travel together. So I think small ways like that, large ways with other spin-offs show you the depth of the project because of its initial vision.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here today and sharing your stories about the origins of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program, about the projects, the money, the struggles, the lovely, what flowered from these initial questions and opportunities that came up now nearly 20 years ago. I am honored to be sitting with the four women who, for the most part, created this beautiful and far-reaching program. And thank you all so much for the work you did and continue to do on behalf of the arts in Portsmouth. Thank you.
Thank you.